The Rattlesnake Gang thought they'd stumbled upon defenseless prey, a silver mine run by a soft-spoken widow with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched on her nose. They'd soon discover that Abigail Thornton had once been Angel of Death, Abigail, the most feared bounty hunter in the Arizona Territory. As bodies begin to fall and blood soaks into the desert sand, the only question remaining would be whether she'd collect all their bounties before sundown. Sweat glistened on sun-weathered faces as three men studied the operations at Silver Creek Mine from the concealment of a nearby ridge. The summer heat bore down mercilessly, turning the Arizona Territory into a shimmering furnace that tested the will of even its most hardened inhabitants. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The tallest of the men, Reed Kincaid, lowered his brass spyglass with a satisfied smile that revealed tobacco-stained teeth beneath his unkempt mustache. "Ain't much security to speak of," he muttered, wiping dust from his weathered face. "Woman runs the place with no more than 6, maybe 7 workers. Shouldn't give us much trouble." Wade Turner, a man whose face bore the pitted scars of smallpox survived in childhood, squinted against the harsh glare. "You sure about this, Reed? We never hit mining operations before. Cattle simpler, quieter too." "Cattle don't pay near. What silver does," Reed countered, his voice carrying the gravel of decades of hard living and cheap whiskey. "Besides, Decker says this widow's sitting on one of the richest veins in the territory, and she don't even know it. The lower shafts where the real money is." The third man, younger than his companions, with a restlessness that showed in constant, small movements, reached for the spyglass. "Let me see her," Charlie Bennett insisted. At 23, he was the newest addition to the Rattlesnake Gang, still eager to prove himself worthy of riding with men whose reputations for ruthlessness spread across 3 territories. Reed handed over the spyglass with a knowing smirk. "Don't get any ideas, boy. Widow Thornton ain't the kind that'll take to your charms. She's been running that operation alone since her husband died in a cave-in 2 years back. Keeps to herself mostly." Through the lens, Charlie focused on a slender woman, moving with purposeful steps between the mine entrance and the assay office. Abigail Thornton didn't match the picture of a mine owner that had formed in his imagination. Instead of the weathered, hard-faced matron he expected, he saw a woman of perhaps 40, with chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun, wire-rimmed spectacles, and movements that suggested efficiency rather than power. She paused to make notations in a leather-bound ledger, her delicate fingers stained with ink, a stark contrast to the rough hands of the miners who respectfully addressed her as she passed. "Don't look like much," Charlie observed, disappointment evident in his tone. "Seems more like a school mom than a mine owner." Reed snatched back the spyglass with a scowl. "That's exactly why this'll be easy pickings. Husband left her with a mine she don't know how to run proper. Half her workers have quit since she took over. Can't pay 'em enough with what little ore they're pulling out." "And Decker's sure about this hidden vein?" Wade questioned, always the most cautious of the 3. "Seems mighty convenient that he knows what's there when the widow don't." "Decker worked that mine for 8 months before Thornton died," Reed explained with thinning patience. "Said the old man was following a narrow seam that suddenly disappeared. Thornton called it bad luck, shut down the lower tunnel. But Decker's been mining since he was 12. Says that vein didn't disappear, it just shifted. Widow never reopened that shaft, probably figuring it wasn't worth the expense." The men fell silent as they watched the activity below, each calculating the risk against the potential reward. The Rattlesnake Gang had built its reputation on cattle, rustling throughout the Arizona Territory and parts of New Mexico, occasionally branching into stagecoach robberies when opportunities presented themselves. This would be their first attempt at claiming a mine, a more permanent and potentially more lucrative operation that could transform their fortunes. "How do you want to play it?" Wade finally asked, accepting that Reed had made his decision regardless of any reservations. Reed's eyes narrowed as he considered their approach. We ride in friendly-like tomorrow morning, claim we're prospectors looking for work, get the lay of the land, count the workers, check their weapons. Then we make our move when the time's right. And the widow? Charlie asked, unable to keep a note of concern from his voice. Reed's expression hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening into well-worn channels of cruelty. Depends on how reasonable she proves to be. Some women know when to recognize a changing of the guard. Others need more convincing. The implication hung in the desert air, drawing a troubled frown from Charlie that did not go unnoticed by Wade, who clapped the younger man on the shoulder. Don't worry about the widow. Women are practical creatures when it comes to survival. She'll see the sense in taking what cash we offer and starting fresh somewhere else. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the three men retreated from their vantage point, making their way back to where their fourth member, Decker Mills, waited with the horses. The former miner's face lit up with anticipation as Reed confirmed they would proceed with the plan. "You're sure it'll work?" Decker asked, his voice carrying an edge of desperation that came from months of anticipating a score that would elevate him from hired gun to partner. "Simple as taking candy from a baby," Reed assured him, with a confidence born of years of successful thefts. "By this time tomorrow, Silver Creek Mine will have new ownership, and the Rattlesnake Gang will be in the silver business." In the tidy cabin that served as both home and office for the owner of Silver Creek Mine, Abigail Thornton sat at a polished oak desk, carefully reviewing the day's production figures by lamplight. The ledger before her told a story of declining yields and increasing costs, a narrative she had watched unfold with growing concern over the past 6 months. Her slender fingers, incongruous against the rugged backdrop of a mining operation, traced the columns of numbers with practiced precision. The cabin itself reflected its owner's dual nature. Part of it maintained the practical functionality demanded by business, while personal touches revealed a refined sensibility unusual in the harsh mining country. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes ranging from practical mining manuals to classics of literature. A small, upright piano stood in one corner, its surface adorned with a daguerreotype of a smiling man with kind eyes and a full beard. Thomas Thornton, whose dreams for the mine had died with him in the accident. A sharp knock at the door interrupted Abigail's calculations. She glanced up, reaching instinctively toward the drawer where she kept a small derringer, a habit formed long before she'd become Abigail Thornton, and one she'd never quite abandoned despite the peaceful years of her marriage. "Who is it?" she called, her voice carrying a gentle lilt that belied the wariness in her posture. "It's Miguel, Senora Thornton," came the reply. "I have the final assay results you wanted." Abigail relaxed, moving her hand away from the drawer. "Come in, Miguel." The door opened to admit a lean Mexican man in his 50s whose weathered face spoke of decades working the mines throughout the territory. Miguel Vasquez had been Thomas's foreman and had stayed on after his death when many others had departed, his loyalty to the widow earning him the distrust of some of the Anglo miners, but the unwavering respect of Abigail herself. The Eastern tunnel shows minimal improvement, Miguel reported, placing a paper on her desk, but still not enough to justify the expense of continuing in that direction. Abigail studied the figures with a slight frown creasing her brow. "And the northern approach?" "Better, but not good enough." Miguel's expression was sympathetic but honest. "Senora, we must consider what we discussed last week. The men are getting restless. 3 more are talking of leaving for the new strike near Prescott." Abigail removed her spectacles, pinching the bridge of her nose where they had left. Small indentations in her skin. Though she maintained the appearance of a genteel widow to the outside world, moments like these revealed flashes of steel beneath the surface, a determination that occasionally surprised even those who thought they knew her well. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "We're not giving up, Miguel," she said firmly. "Thomas believed in this mine. He saw something in these hills that others missed." "Don Thomas was a good man with good instincts," Miguel acknowledged with quiet respect. "But even he abandoned the lower shaft when the vein disappeared. Perhaps it is time to consider selling to one of the larger operations. Sentinel Mining has expressed interest again." Abigail replaced her spectacles and closed the ledger with a decisive movement. "The lower shaft," she mused, her mind working through possibilities that had been forming for weeks. Thomas always said the vein didn't simply end, it had to go somewhere. Miguel shifted uncomfortably. "Senora, reopening the lower shaft would require capital we don't have. The support structures need replacement. The pumps aren't functioning. I have personal funds." Abigail interrupted, a new resolve evident in her voice. "Enough to finance a limited exploration. Thomas was following his instincts when the accident happened. I want to know what he saw down there." "It is your decision," Miguel conceded, though his expression remained doubtful. "But perhaps we should bring in additional security if we reopen that section. There have been rumors of the Rattlesnake Gang operating in this area." A curious change passed over Abigail's face at the mention of the gang, something so subtle that anyone who didn't know her well might have missed it entirely. For the briefest moment, her eyes hardened with recognition, her posture shifting almost imperceptibly, from that of a genteel widow to something more vigilant, more dangerous. "The cattle thieves?" she asked, her tone carefully modulated to convey only mild concern. "They've never bothered with mining operations before." "They go where the money is," Miguel replied with the pragmatism of a man who had witnessed the territory's lawlessness firsthand. "And people talk. If we start work on the lower shaft, word will spread about why." Abigail nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in his warning. "Have Jackson and Williams take extra watches tonight. I'll speak with Sheriff Calloway when he makes his rounds tomorrow." After Miguel departed, Abigail remained at her desk, seemingly returning to her accounting, but once alone, she moved with surprising quickness to a trunk kept locked beneath her bed. The key hung on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her high-collared blouse, a secret kept close to her heart, alongside other remnants of a life she had left behind when she became Mrs. Thomas Thornton. The lock turned with a soft click, and Abigail lifted the lid to reveal neatly folded dresses and personal items, the visible contents that anyone might expect to find. With practiced movements, she lifted out the false bottom to expose what lay hidden beneath. A gun belt of tooled, leather-sized for a woman's waist, with twin holsters containing matched Colt revolvers with pearl grips. Beside them lay a small leather-bound journal, a tin star tarnished with age, and several wanted posters, yellowed and creased from years of storage. Abigail's fingers traced the star almost reverently before moving to the journal. She opened it to an entry dated 8 years earlier, the last entry she had made before meeting Thomas and embracing the promise of a different life. Final account settled with the McCready brothers outside Tucson. 3 bounties collected. Marshal Davis offers a permanent position with Arizona territorial law, but I've declined. 10 years is enough. The nightmares are coming more frequently now. I see their faces when I close my eyes. 27 men, sent to their maker by my hand. Some deserved worse deaths than I gave them. Others might have deserved better. No matter now. I'm heading north, away from the territories that know the name Angel of Death, Abigail. She closed the journal with a deep breath, memories flooding back of a time when her name had been whispered with fear around campfires throughout the Southwest. For 10 years, She had tracked the territory's most dangerous outlaws, earning a reputation for relentless pursuit and deadly accuracy with her twin Colts. The Angel of Death moniker had come from her habit of wearing a black duster and wide-brimmed. That gave her an almost spectral appearance when she appeared at dawn or dusk to serve justice. Meeting Thomas Thornton had changed everything. The gentle mining engineer had seen beyond her fearsome reputation to the woman who yearned for peace after a decade of violence. Their marriage had given her the chance to bury Angel of Death Abigail beneath the respectable identity of Mrs. Thornton, mine owner's wife, and eventually widow. For 6 years, 2 during Thomas's life and 4 since his death, she had maintained the deception successfully, becoming the person she had pretended to be. Now, with the mention of the Rattlesnake Gang, threads from her past threatened to entangle with her present. The gang's leader, Reed Kincaid, was no stranger to Abigail. 8 years earlier, she had tracked and captured his brother Ezra for the murder of a family near Flagstaff. Ezra had hanged for his crimes, while Reed had sworn vengeance on the bounty hunter responsible, unaware that the fearsome figure in the black duster had been a woman. Abigail carefully replaced the items in their hiding place, sealing away the physical reminders of her former life. Yet as she relocked the trunk and slid it back beneath the bed, she knew that some preparations might be necessary. If the Rattlesnake Gang was indeed operating nearby, it might be mere coincidence. Or it might be that Reed Kincaid had finally discovered the identity of the bounty hunter who had sent his brother to the gallows. Either way, Abigail determined Silver Creek Mine would be ready. The peaceful widow who had managed the operation since her husband's death might appear vulnerable to those who saw only what they expected to see. But beneath the spectacles and ink-stained fingers lay the instincts and abilities of a woman who had once been the territory's most feared dispenser of frontier justice. That night, as a single oil lamp burned in the cabin window, casting its glow across the darkened mining camp, Abigail made her decision. Tomorrow, she would indeed reopen the lower shaft, following Thomas's final intuition about the silver vein. But she would also begin watching for signs that the past she had so carefully buried might be clawing its way back to the surface, ready to draw her into one final confrontation. In the soft glow of the lamplight, she removed her spectacles and let down her hair, the transformation subtle but significant. For a brief moment, with the constraints of her daytime persona loosened, a glimpse of Angel of Death Abigail emerged, her eyes sharper, her posture straighter, her awareness of every sound in the night more acute. The gentle widow and the legendary bounty hunter were two sides of the same coin, both authentic parts of a complex woman forged in the unforgiving crucible of the frontier. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the scrub brush and twisted, juniper trees carrying dust and secrets across the moonlit landscape. In the distance, the howl of a coyote rose like a warning, echoing off canyon walls before fading into the vast silence of the Arizona night. By this time tomorrow, the delicate balance Abigail had maintained for years would face its greatest test, as past and present collided in a reckoning that had been 8 years in the making. Morning arrived with the harsh clarity peculiar to the desert, the rising sun burning away the night's cool stillness and painting the rugged landscape in shades of gold and amber. Activity at Silver Creek Mine began early, as it did most days, with miners arriving for their shifts and the rhythmic sounds of picks striking stone soon echoing from the main tunnel. Abigail emerged from her cabin dressed in a practical dark blue skirt and white blouse, her hair once again secured in its customary bun, spectacles perched on her nose. She carried her ledger under one arm, the very picture of an organized business owner beginning her day. Yet subtle differences marked her appearance and behavior from the previous day. The high-necked blouse concealed not only the key around her neck, but also a small derringer secured in a specially sewn pocket, Her skirts, while modest and appropriate, had been carefully adjusted to allow freer movement should the need arise. Most revealing was the change in her awareness, her eyes, constantly scanning the surroundings, noting positions of workers, cataloguing details that most would overlook. To a casual observer, she appeared simply to be a diligent overseer checking on operations. To anyone trained in the art of survival, she moved with the heightened vigilance of prey that senses predators approaching. Abigail had just finished consulting with Miguel about preparations for reopening the lower shaft when movement at the edge of the camp caught her attention. 3 riders approached at an unhurried pace, their figures shimmering slightly in the morning heat. Something in their formation, in the deliberate spacing between them, sent a warning prickling across Abigail's skin. These were not casual travelers or prospectors seeking employment. "Miguel," she said quietly, maintaining her composed expression, "we have visitors. Please continue preparations as we discussed, but have Jackson and Williams stay within sight." The foreman followed her gaze to the approaching riders, his experienced eyes narrowing slightly. "Si, senora," he replied with a slight nod, perceiving the caution beneath her calm directive. Abigail moved to the front of the assay office, positioning herself where she appeared welcoming but maintained clear lines of retreat. As the riders drew closer, she studied them with the practiced assessment she had once applied to every stranger who crossed her path during her bounty hunting days. The leader, she identified him immediately by his position and the deferent spacing of his companions, was a tall man with a hard face, weathered by sun and marked by the excesses of a violent life. His eyes, cold and calculating, surveyed the mining operation with the predatory focus of someone evaluating assets rather than seeking honest work. The second man bore the distinctive scars of smallpox, his expression more guarded, constantly scanning their surroundings for threats. The third was notably younger, perhaps in his early 20s, with a nervousness to his movements that suggested less experience than his companions. Abigail felt a flash of recognition as the men drew close enough for clear identification. Though she had never confronted him directly, she had studied enough wanted posters to recognize Reed Kincaid. The leader of the Rattlesnake Gang had aged since those sketches had been circulated, lines of cruelty deepening around his mouth, grey streaking the once dark hair, but the resemblance to his hanged brother Ezra was unmistakable. For a moment, Abigail wondered if he had somehow discovered her identity, if this visit was the culmination of an 8-year quest for vengeance rather than a simple attempt at appropriating a struggling mine. She steadied herself, remembering that her appearance had changed significantly since her bounty hunting days. The Angel of Death had been a shadowy figure, face often concealed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, identity carefully guarded. No one looking at Abigail Thornton, respectable widow and mine owner, would see the woman who had tracked killers across the harshest terrain in the territory. "Good morning, gentlemen," she called, her voice carrying the gentle refinement that had become second nature during her years with Thomas. "What brings you to Silver Creek?" Reed Kincaid touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning, Mom. Name's Robert Kennedy. These are my associates, Mr. Watson and young Charlie here." He inclined his head toward the smallpox-scarred man and the younger rider in turn. "We're prospectors looking for work. Heard Silver Creek might be hiring experienced men." The false names confirmed Abigail's suspicions, even as she maintained her welcoming smile. "I'm afraid you've received outdated information, Mr. Kennedy. Silver Creek isn't currently expanding our operations." The lie came easily, a necessary precaution until she could better assess their intentions. Reed dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his size, handing his reins to the younger man. "That's not what we heard, Mrs. Thornton. Word travels, you know. Talk is you're reopening the lower shaft, following a vein your husband was working before his untimely passing." The specific knowledge sent a chill through Abigail. Their information was too detailed, too recent to have been gathered casually. Someone in her operation was feeding information to the Rattlesnake Gang, or was part of it. She made a mental note to review every hire made in the past 6 months, even as she formulated her response. "You seem remarkably well informed about my business affairs, Mr. Kennedy," she observed, allowing a hint of steel to enter her tone, especially for prospectors just passing through. The smallpox-scarred man, Wade Turner, if Abigail's memory of wanted posters served correctly, shifted uneasily at her directness, but Reed merely smiled, the expression never warming his cold eyes. "Mining communities talk, Mrs. Thornton. Men move between operations, share information, nothing mysterious about it." He took a step closer, his considerable height allowing him to look down at her in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating posture. "Truth is, we've got experience with exactly the kind of deposit you're sitting on. Might be we could offer valuable assistance in exchange for a fair arrangement." Abigail held her ground, adjusting her spectacles in a gesture calculated to reinforce her image as a genteel widow, while giving her a moment to observe the positions of her workers around the camp. Miguel had positioned himself near the assay office with Jackson and Williams nearby, all three clearly watching the interaction while pretending to focus on their tasks. "I appreciate your interest, Mr. Kennedy, but Silver Creek's current staff includes highly experienced miners. If our circumstances change, I'll certainly keep your offer in mind." She gestured toward the cookhouse at the edge of the camp. "Our cook, Mrs. Hollister, can provide you and your men with a meal before you continue your journey, if you wish." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. Reed's expression tightened momentarily before he forced another smile. "Most hospitable of you, Mrs. Thornton. Perhaps we'll take you up on that offer. But I wonder if I might trouble you for a brief tour of your operation first. Always instructive to see how different mines are managed." The request was a transparent attempt to assess the mine's defenses and value more thoroughly. Abigail weighed her options, recognizing that an outright refusal might accelerate whatever timeline Reed had planned. Better to control his access, learn what she could of his intentions, and prepare accordingly. "A brief tour would be no trouble at all," she agreed with a smile that mirrored his in its lack of sincerity. "Though I'm afraid the lower shaft remains, closed pending safety inspections. I wouldn't want visitors to be at risk." As Abigail led Reed Kincaid toward the main tunnel, outwardly every inch the accommodating business owner, her mind was already racing several steps ahead. The Rattlesnake Gang had found Silver Creek Mine, bringing with them the violence of her past life. Whether by coincidence or design, Reed Kincaid, brother of a man she had brought to justice years ago, now stood within arm's reach, unaware that the gentle widow guiding him through her property had once been the angel of death. By sunset, Abigail knew blood would soak into the desert sand. The only questions remaining were how many would fall, and whether the peaceful life she had built could survive the coming storm. The main tunnel of Silver Creek Mine swallowed sound in its cool darkness, the temperature dropping noticeably as Abigail led Reed Kincaid deeper into the mountain. Oil lamps hung at regular intervals along rough-hewn walls, casting elongated shadows that danced with their movement. The rhythmic striking of picks against stone echoed from side passages where miners worked narrow seams of ore. "Not what I expected," Reed commented, his voice bouncing off the stone walls as his eyes assessed support beams and surveyed equipment with the practiced gaze of someone who understood mining operations. Thornton ran a tight operation. "My husband believed in doing things properly," Abigail replied, noting how Reed studied every detail, counting miners, evaluating escape routes, measuring the mine's defenses with calculating precision. Safety was his primary concern. Ironic, considering how he died. The comment was deliberately provocative, testing her reaction. Abigail's step faltered almost imperceptibly. Thomas's death was investigated thoroughly by the territorial inspector. A support beam failed in the lower shaft, a beam that had been recently replaced and should have held. Reed's eyebrows rose with apparent interest. Suggesting what exactly? Nothing was ever proven. Abigail kept her tone neutral despite the painful memories his question evoked. Mining has always been dangerous work. They continued in silence, until reaching a heavy wooden barrier blocking a side tunnel that angled downward into darkness. Faded lettering across the planks warned, "Danger, closed by order of management." "The lower shaft, I presume?" Reed asked, reaching out to touch the weathered wood. Abigail positioned herself between Reed and the barrier. "As I mentioned earlier, it's closed pending safety evaluations. The structural integrity was compromised during the accident." Reed's eyes narrowed slightly. "Curious timing that you're suddenly interested in reopening it after 2 years, almost as if someone told you what might be waiting down there." The accusation hung in the air between them, confirming Abigail's suspicion that the Rattlesnake gang had inside information. She adjusted her spectacles, using the gesture to scan the tunnel behind them, where Wade Turner had followed at a distance, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. "Mining is as much intuition as science. Mr. Kennedy, my husband left detailed journals of his work. I've simply been reviewing them more thoroughly in recent months." Before Reed could respond, the distinctive sound of a minecart's wheels on tracks approached from behind. A young miner pushed the half-filled cart toward them, slowing as he noticed the visitors blocking the narrow passage. "Pardon, Mrs. Thornton," he called, his voice carrying the lilt of an Irish accent. "Need to get this ore to the sorting shed." "Of course, Danny," Abigail replied, using the interruption to create distance between herself and Reed as they pressed against the tunnel wall to allow the cart to pass. Reed watched the young miner with unusual intensity. "New hire?" he asked. As the cart continued down the tunnel, "Danny joined us 3 months ago. Hard worker." Abigail noted Reed's interest with concern. "Shall we continue toward the main shaft? The engineering is quite impressive. Thomas designed the bracing system himself." As they resumed walking, Abigail's mind categorized potential threats and advantages throughout the mine. The tunnels offered confined spaces where her smaller frame and intimate knowledge of the layout would give her an edge if confrontation became necessary. The miners themselves were skilled with tools that could serve as weapons, though few carried firearms underground due to the danger of accidental discharge in the confined space. Most importantly, she knew what Reed Kincaid did not: the location of a secondary exit Thomas had created as an emergency escape route after a cave-in had temporarily trapped miners 3 years earlier. The narrow passage emerged nearly a quarter-mile from the main entrance, hidden among rocks that made it all, but invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. Their tour concluded at the main shaft, where an elaborate system of pulleys and cables controlled the lift that transported men and materials between levels. Reed studied the mechanism with undisguised appreciation. "Your husband was no ordinary a mining engineer," he observed, watching as the platform descended with 2 miners aboard. "This is custom work." "Thomas believed innovation was essential in mining," Abigail replied, genuine pride momentarily replacing her wariness. "He designed several improvements that have since been adopted by larger operations." Reed turned to face her fully, his earlier pretense of friendly interest fading into something more direct. "Mrs. Thornton, let's speak plainly. Your mine is struggling. That's common knowledge in these parts. The accessible ore is depleting. Your workforce has dwindled, and you lack the capital to expand operations effectively." Abigail met his gaze steadily. "Yet you seem remarkably interested in acquiring it." "I represent interests that can inject the necessary resources to make Silver Creek profitable again," Reed continued, abandoning his prospector pretense. $20,000, a generous offer for a failing operation, enough for you to return east and live comfortably. The sum was substantial, more than fair for the mine's apparent value based on current production. But it confirmed what Abigail already suspected. Reed Kincaid knew exactly what lay in the lower shaft, and it was worth considerably more than his offer. "Silver Creek is not for sale, Mr. Kennedy," she replied with quiet firmness. "It was my husband's life's work, and I intend to honor his legacy by continuing it." Frustration flickered across Reed's features before he mastered it. "Sentimentality is an expensive luxury, Mrs. Thornton. Your husband is dead, and this mine is slowly following him to the grave. $20,000 is more than fair." "This discussion is concluded," Abigail stated, her gentle demeanor hardening. "Miguel will show you and your men to the cookhouse if you're still interested in that meal. Otherwise, I wish you safe travels." Reed studied her face for a long moment, searching for weaknesses and finding fewer than he had expected. "We'll be staying in the area for a few days," he finally said, his tone carrying an unmistakable warning. "Perhaps you'll reconsider once you've had time to reflect on your situation." The cookhouse sat at the edge of the mining camp, a simple wooden structure that served as dining hall and social center for the dozen men who still worked Silver Creek Mine. Inside, Reed Kincaid and his companions sat at a corner table speaking, in low tones while occasionally glancing toward the door. They had accepted the offered meal, though their purpose clearly had nothing to do with hunger. "She knows something," Reed muttered, tearing a piece of bread with unnecessary force. "The widow isn't as naive as Decker led us to believe." "Wade," Turner shrugged, his pockmarked face impassive. "Doesn't matter what she knows, we've got the numbers and the guns. Question is timing, tonight or wait another day." Charlie Bennett, the youngest of the three, looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Maybe we should try offering more. She seemed real attached to the place because of her husband. Reed fixed the young man with a cold stare. 30 men have joined the Rattlesnake Gang over the years, Charlie. Know how many are still riding with us? 3. Know why? He jabbed a finger toward the table's surface for emphasis. "Because I don't tolerate softness. That woman is sitting on a silver deposit worth hundreds of thousands, and she doesn't even know it. We're taking it tonight, and she'll be lucky if all she loses is the mine." Their conversation halted as the cookhouse door opened, admitting a burly miner whose massive frame seemed at odds with his gentle movements. The man nodded respectfully to Mrs. Hollister, the elderly woman who managed the kitchen, before noticing the 3 strangers in the corner. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he made no comment as he collected a cup of coffee. "Garrett," Mrs. Hollister called to him, "is Miguel still wanting that repair to the sorting shed roof before the next shipment?" "Yes'm," the large man replied, his deep voice surprisingly soft. "Planning to see to it this afternoon, weather permitting." Reed watched the exchange with interest, cataloguing another name and face for later reference. Once Garrett had departed, with his coffee, Reed leaned closer to his companions. "We move at midnight," he whispered. "Charlie, ride back to Decker and tell him to bring the others. We'll need all hands for this." As Charlie rose to leave, Reed caught his arm in a grip that would leave bruises. "And Charlie, no more talk about offering the widow more money. When we're done, she'll be grateful just to walk away with her life." In her cabin, Abigail Thornton methodically cleaned the matched Colt revolvers she had retrieved from their hiding place. Each movement was practiced and efficient, muscle memory, from years when maintaining her weapons had been as routine as breathing. The pearl grips gleamed in the afternoon light, filtering through the window, the only ornamentation on otherwise utilitarian tools. Miguel Vasquez sat opposite her at the small table, his weathered face grave as he watched her preparations. "You see," Foreman was the only person at Silver Creek who knew anything of Abigail's past. though even he didn't know the full extent of her former identity. Thomas had trusted Miguel with the knowledge that his wife had once worked in law enforcement and possessed skills unusual for a woman of her background. "They will come tonight," Miguel stated with certainty. "I saw them watching the guard. Rotations, counting our men." Abigail nodded, checking the cylinder of the second revolver before returning it to the holster. "Reed Kincaid doesn't strike me as a man who tolerates delays once he's decided on a course of action." "Kincaid? Not Kennedy?" Miguel's eyes widened with recognition. "The rustler, leader of the Rattlesnake Gang?" "The same." Abigail's expression remained composed as she began sorting ammunition, selecting only the cartridges she knew to be most reliable. "They believe there's a rich silver deposit in the lower shaft, one valuable enough to justify killing for." "Is there?" Miguel asked, his direct question reflecting years of mutual respect. Abigail's hands paused in their work. "Thomas thought so. The night before the accident, he told me he'd found something significant, a new vein that angled away from where they'd been digging. He was excited, planned to explore it the next day." Her voice remained steady, despite the painful memory. "He never got the chance. And you believe his death wasn't an accident. The support beam that failed had been replaced just days earlier. Thomas supervised the work himself." Abigail resumed loading cartridges into a belt designed to fit beneath her clothing. Someone wanted that vein to remain undiscovered. Miguel processed this information in silence before asking, "What do you need from me?" "Get as many men out of camp as possible without raising suspicion," Abigail instructed. "Send teams to the North Ridge for prospecting. Tell them I've authorized extra pay for the night shift. The fewer people here when Kincaid makes his move, the better." "Garrett will stay," Miguel stated rather than asked. "And Jackson. They were both army men before turning to mining. They can handle themselves." Abigail nodded agreement. 3 miners with combat experience plus the 2 of us against however many men Kincaid brings. Not favorable odds, but I've faced worse." Miguel studied her with newfound curiosity. "You have lived an interesting life, Senora Thornton." A ghost of a smile touched Abigail's lips. "More interesting than anyone in these parts would believe." "Miguel, and considerably more violent." As Miguel departed to begin evacuating selected miners, Abigail returned the weapons to their hiding place. Tonight she would become someone she had hoped never to be again, a dealer in death rather than a respectable widow. The transformation brought neither joy nor sorrow, only a grim acceptance that some parts of ourselves can never truly be abandoned. Sheriff Daniel Calloway's monthly visits to the outlying properties in his jurisdiction were more courtesy than necessity. At 58, with a slight limp from an old bullet wound and thinning grey hair beneath his wide-brimmed hat, he cut a less imposing figure than he once had. Still, his reputation for fairness and unwavering courage ensured respect throughout the county. His arrival at Silver Creek Mine that afternoon coincided with unusual activity. Teams of miners departing with equipment loaded on mules, heading toward the northern ridges despite the late hour. The sheriff reined his horse to a stop near the assay office, where Abigail stood reviewing documents with Miguel. "Afternoon, Mrs. Thornton," he called, dismounting with a slight grimace as his bad leg took his weight. "Looks like you've got men heading out rather than coming in. Found a new prospect." Abigail greeted him with the warm smile she reserved for the few people in her new life she genuinely trusted. Sheriff Calloway had been Thomas's friend before becoming hers, and his monthly visits were typically social occasions as much as official. "Business? Following a hunch, Sheriff," she replied, accepting his offered handshake. Thomas always believed the North Ridge held promise. Seemed time to investigate properly. Calloway's eyes, still sharp despite his advancing years, noted details others might miss. The tension in Abigail's posture, the unusual number of men remaining in camp who carried sidearms, the watchful positioning of Garrett near the main entrance to the mine. Must be quite a hunch to justify overtime for so many men, he observed casually, though his gaze had turned searching. Miguel excused himself to oversee the departing teams, leaving Abigail alone with the lawman. She considered her options carefully. Before speaking, "Walk with me, Daniel," she suggested, using his given name as she did, only in private. "There are matters I'd value your perspective on." They strolled toward the edge of camp, where pines offered shade from the afternoon sun, stopping at a point that offered a view of both the approach road and the mining operation. For several moments they stood in companionable silence before Abigail spoke. "We had visitors this morning, 3 men claiming to be prospectors looking for work." Calloway's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "Unusual timing given your current staffing. In Challenges, they called themselves Kennedy, Watson and Charlie. Their actual identities are Reed Kincaid, Wade Turner, and a younger man I don't recognize from the wanted circulars." Abigail's voice had changed subtly, taking on a crispness that caught the sheriff's attention. "The Rattlesnake Gang, Daniel. They're planning to take Silver Creek Mine." The sheriff's hand moved unconsciously toward his holstered Colt. "You're certain? Kincaid's bunch has never hit mining operations before. They believe there's a particularly rich vein in the lower shaft, one valuable enough to change their usual patterns." Abigail turned to face him directly. "I'm sending as many innocent people away as I can manage without alerting them. But I expect trouble tonight." Calloway studied her with new intensity. "I should ride for deputies, with enough men—" "Prescott, is 4 hours hard riding?" Abigail interrupted gently. "They'll move before you could possibly return. Besides, your presence here might accelerate their timeline. You're suggesting I leave you to face the Rattlesnake Gang alone?" Disbelief colored the sheriff's voice. "Abigail, I can't do that. Thomas knew more about me than most," she interrupted, meeting his gaze steadily, "including certain skills from my life before Arizona." Understanding dawned slowly in the sheriff's eyes. "You were something more than a school teacher." "Back east," he said, the statement not quite a question. "Something considerably more," Abigail confirmed with a slight nod. "I can handle Reed Kincaid and his men, Daniel, but I need you to ensure the law recognizes my actions as justified when this is over." The sheriff removed his hat, running a hand through thinning hair as he processed her words. "You're asking me to ride away, knowing there's going to be bloodshed, possibly multiple deaths. I'm asking you to trust that I know what I'm doing," Abigail clarified, "and to understand that some confrontations are inevitable, regardless of how much we might wish to avoid them." Calloway replaced his hat, his expression troubled but resolute. "I'll ride as far as Copper Junction," he decided, naming a small settlement approximately an hour away. "I'll wait there until morning. If I haven't heard from you by dawn, I'll return with whatever men I can gather." Relief softened Abigail's features momentarily. "Thank you, Daniel. That's more than fair." As the sheriff prepared to depart, he paused beside his horse, fixing Abigail with a penetrating look. "Thomas once told me there was more to you than met the eye, said you carried shadows that had nothing to do with being a miner's wife." He tightened the cinch on his saddle with practiced movements. "Always wondered what he meant by that." "Perhaps. After tonight, I'll tell you the full story," Abigail offered, though uncertainty tinged her voice. "Assuming there's still a place for me here when it's over." Calloway mounted his horse with a grunt of effort. "Whatever happens, whatever you've been, this is your home now. Remember that." With a final nod, he turned his mount toward the road leading away from Silver Creek Mine, dust rising in small clouds beneath his horse's hooves. Abigail watched him go, wondering if his assessment would hold true once the truth was known. The peaceful life she had built with Thomas, and fought to maintain after his death, hung by, an increasingly frayed thread. By morning, the facade of the genteel widow would likely be shattered beyond repair, revealing the deadly hunter beneath. As shadows lengthened across the mining camp, Abigail returned to her cabin to make final preparations. The Rattlesnake Gang was coming, bringing with them violence that would force her to become once more the woman she had tried so hard to leave behind. Angel of Death Abigail, whose twin colts had claimed 27 lives in the name of justice. By dawn, that number would almost certainly increase. Twilight painted the western sky in bands of crimson and gold, as Abigail stood before the small mirror in her cabin, regarding her reflection with detached curiosity. The transformation was both subtle and profound. Gone were the spectacles that had softened her appearance for years. Her chestnut hair, freed from its restrictive bun, hung in a practical braid down her back. The high-collared blouse and proper skirt had been replaced by dark trousers and a fitted jacket that allowed freedom of movement while concealing the twin colts holstered at her waist. The face that stared back at her seemed to belong to a stranger, or rather, to someone she had once known intimately, but had deliberately forgotten. The gentle curves of the widow Thornton had given way to the sharp angles of a hunter's vigilance. Even her eyes appeared different, the warm hazel hardening to the color of sun-baked earth. "There you are," she whispered to her reflection. "I wondered if you still existed." A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. "Senora," Miguel called through the door. "They're coming. Dust on the eastern approach." Abigail opened the door to find her foreman similarly transformed. Gone was the deferential employee. In his place stood a man whose steady gaze and balanced stance spoke of experience with violence. A Winchester rifle rested comfortably in his hands and a worn cartridge belt circled his waist. "How many?" she asked, collecting a black hat from a peg beside the door, the final piece of her transformation. "At least 8 riders," Miguel reported. "Moving slowly, still about 20 minutes out. Garrett and Jackson are in position at the main shaft. Williams has taken up watch on the north ridge with a spyglass." Abigail nodded her approval of these arrangements. "And the remaining workers? All gone, except for Cook. The old woman refused to leave her kitchen, said no outlaws would prevent her from preparing tomorrow's bread." A hint of amusement softened Miguel's expression briefly. "She has a shotgun beneath the counter. Mrs. Hollister is tougher than most men I've known," Abigail observed with a faint smile. "Keep her away from the fighting if possible, but I suspect she'll handle herself if necessary." Together, they moved across the darkening camp toward the assay office, which offered both tactical advantages for defense and clear sight lines to the approach road. Abigail's movements had changed, Miguel noted with fascination. The measured, deliberate steps of the mine owner had been replaced by a predatory grace, silent and efficient, wasting no energy as she glided through evening shadows like a hunting cat. "You've done this before," Miguel observed quietly as they took up positions inside the office, prepared for an ambush. Abigail checked the loads in her revolvers one final time before responding. "More times than I care to remember. The Arizona territory breeds a particular kind of violence, one that requires a particular kind of response." She moved to the window, using the edge of the frame for concealment as she studied the eastern horizon. A faint cloud of dust marked the approach of Kincaid's reinforcements, silhouetted against the deepening blue of the evening sky. "There was a massacre near Yuma," Miguel said thoughtfully. 8 years ago, a family of settlers killed for their land and cattle. The territorial marshals couldn't find the culprits, but a bounty hunter tracked them for weeks, brought 3 men to justice, and sent 2 more to their graves. Abigail remained focused on the horizon, neither confirming nor denying the implied connection. Justice takes many forms in these territories. Sometimes the law needs assistance. The bounty hunter wore black, Miguel continued, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence, appeared like a shadow at dawn or dusk. Some who saw this hunter said it was a ghost, an angel of death collecting the souls of the wicked. Now Abigail turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. Superstitious nonsense. I was just a woman with a particular set of skills and a strong sense of right and wrong. The inadvertent admission hung between them for a moment, before Miguel nodded slowly. As you are tonight, Senora. As you are tonight. Their conversation ended as the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them. Abigail moved deeper into the shadowed interior of the office, positioning herself where she could observe without being seen. Remember, she instructed quietly, we defend, we don't pursue. If Kincaid's men scatter, let them go. I want him and his lieutenants, not every misguided fool who rides with him. Miguel took up his position on the opposite side of the office, rifle ready. And if Kincaid escapes, Abigail's expression hardened in the darkness. He won't. Reed Kincaid led his expanded force into Silver Creek's central yard with the confidence of a man who expected little resistance. The 8 riders moved in practiced formation, spreading out to cover the main buildings while maintaining clear lines of fire between them. Reed himself, flanked by Wade Turner and the recently returned Charlie Bennett, approached the darkened cabin that served as Abigail's residence and office. Mighty quiet, Wade observed suspiciously, his scarred face tightening as he scanned the surrounding structures. Where are all the miners? Night shifts probably in the tunnels, Reed replied, though his expression revealed similar concern. At the camp's stillness. Widow's likely in her cabin. Decker Mills, the former miner whose information had brought them to Silver Creek, sidled his horse closer. Something's wrong, Reed. There should be men moving between shifts, lights in. The cookhouse. Reed silenced him with a sharp gesture. Spread out, he ordered the others. Check the bunkhouse, assay office, and main shaft. Charlie, you're with me. As the riders dispersed to follow his commands, Reed dismounted before Abigail's cabin, drawing his revolver with practiced ease. Mrs. Thornton, he called, loud enough to be heard within but not to carry across the entire camp. I'd like to continue our business discussion. Silence answered him. Reed exchanged glances with Charlie, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Kick it in, Reed ordered, gesturing toward the door. Charlie hesitated. Maybe. Oh, she's not here. Could be with the miners, or... I said kick it in, boy. Reed's tone left no room for debate. The younger man reluctantly dismounted and approached the cabin door. His boot connected solidly with the wood near the latch, splintering it inward. The door swung open to reveal darkness, the cabin's interior illuminated only by faint moonlight filtering through windows. Reed pushed past Charlie, striking a match to light the oil lamp on the small desk. The warm glow revealed an empty cabin, the bed neatly made, a half-finished cup of tea on the table suggesting the occupant had departed in the midst of her evening routine. She knew we were coming, Reed snarled, extinguishing the match with a sharp motion of his wrist. Someone warned her. Outside, a sudden shout from the direction of the main shaft shattered the night's quiet. A single gunshot followed, then another. Reed rushed to the doorway in time to see one of his men thrown backward from the entrance to the mine, his body crumpling in a lifeless heap on the ground. "It's a trap!" Wade called from where he'd taken cover behind a water trough. "They're waiting for us!" Reed cursed viciously, scanning the darkened camp for signs of movement. The strategic disadvantage of their position became suddenly painfully clear. They were exposed in the central yard, while defenders could fire from the concealment of doorways and windows. Another shot rang out from the direction of the assay office, striking a rider who had ventured too close. The man clutched his shoulder with a cry of pain, wheeling his horse in a frantic circle before gaining control. "Get to cover," Reed ordered Charlie, pushing the younger man toward the relative. Safety of the cabin's interior. He raised his voice to address the scattered members of his gang. Find the widow. She's the key to this place. From her vantage point in the assay office, Abigail watched the confusion spreading among Kincaid's men with grim satisfaction. The initial volley had caught them unprepared, shattering their expectations of an easy conquest. Now they scrambled for cover, their formation broken, coordination lost in the chaos of unexpected resistance. Miguel fired again, his shot striking a water barrel near one of the outlaws, sending the man diving for better protection. They do not fight well when surprised, he observed dryly. Few do, Abigail replied, her attention focused on the cabin where Reed Kincaid had retreated with the younger gang member. Most men who rely on intimidation crumble when faced with true opposition. She noted the positions of the remaining riders, 3 seeking shelter near the cookhouse, 2 returning fire from behind mining equipment, and 1 wounded man struggling to control his panicked horse. Wade Turner had established a defensive position behind the water trough, while Decker Mills, whom she recognized from his time working the mine, was frantically trying to rally the others from behind a stack of lumber. Focus on the ones by the cookhouse, Abigail instructed Miguel. Keep them pinned down. I'm going to circle behind and approach the cabin from the rear. Miguel nodded, already adjusting his aim. Be careful, Senora. Kincaid strikes me as a man who grows more dangerous when cornered. Abigail slipped out the back door of the assay office, keeping to the shadows as she moved swiftly along the perimeter of the camp. The sporadic exchange of gunfire continued, providing cover for her approach as she circled toward her cabin. Years of tracking criminals across difficult terrain had taught her how to move undetected, placing each foot with deliberate care to avoid creating sound. Reaching the back of her cabin, she paused to listen. Voices filtered through the thin walls, Reed Kincaid issuing harsh instructions, the younger man responding with audible reluctance. Through a small window she could make out their shadows moving inside the lamplit interior. Don't care. How many men they have, Reed was saying, his tone vicious with frustration. We find the widow. We control the mine. Everything else is just obstacles. She could be anywhere, the younger voice protested. Could have ridden for the law for all we know. No, Reed countered with certainty. She's here. A woman like that doesn't abandon what's hers. The insight surprised Abigail. Reed Kincaid had perceived something fundamental about her character despite their brief interaction. Perhaps he was more dangerous than she had initially assessed. She moved silently to the rear door, testing the handle with exquisite caution. It turned without sound. She had oiled the hinges just hours earlier in preparation for exactly this moment. Drawing one of her revolvers, Abigail eased the door open just enough to slip inside, finding herself in the small kitchen area separated from the main room by a partial wall. We need to pull back, Charlie was insisting, panic edging into his voice. Regroup with the others, figure out what we're up against. Coward, Reed spat. I knew you didn't have the stomach for real work. This mine is worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary. No mine is worth dying for, Abigail stated, calmly, stepping around the dividing wall with her Colt leveled at Reed's chest. Both men froze at her sudden appearance, their expressions displaying radically different reactions. Charlie's face registered shock tinged with relief, as if her presence offered an escape from the escalating situation. Reed's features shifted from surprise to calculation in an instant, his eyes narrowing as he took in her transformed appearance. Well, now, he drawled, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. Mrs. Thornton, you're full of surprises, or should I call you something else? My name doesn't matter, Abigail replied, her aim unwavering. What matters is that you miscalculated badly, Mr. Kincaid. Silver Creek Mine isn't defenseless, and I'm not the helpless widow you assumed I was. Reed's expression darkened at her use of his real name. "So you knew all along. Impressive. But it doesn't change the outcome. I have 8 men out there. You can't possibly have more than 3 or 4 defenders." "Quality over quantity," Abigail countered, her voice taking on the harder edge of her former persona. "Your men are already falling. Surrender now, and you might leave this camp alive." A dangerous smile spread across Reed's face. "I don't surrender, Mom. Never have, never will." His gaze shifted fractionally over her shoulder. "Especially when I hold the high cards." Abigail sensed movement behind her a split second before. Wade Turner's voice cut through the tension. "Drop the gun, lady, or I ventilate that pretty head of yours." She didn't need to turn to know Wade had entered through the front door while she focused on Reed. The cold pressure of a gun barrel against the back of her neck confirmed her tactical error. She had underestimated the coordination between the gang members. "Slowly now," Wade instructed as Reed's smile widened in triumph. "Place it on the floor and kick it over here." Abigail assessed her options in the fleeting moment before she would need to comply. The second Colt remained holstered at her left hip, concealed by her jacket, but drawing it would be suicide with Wade's gun pressed against her skull. Reed stood too far away for a sudden lunge, and the young Charlie seemed paralyzed by the rapidly escalating situation. She lowered her revolver, gradually kneeling to place it on the wooden floorboards. As she straightened, preparing to kick it toward Reed, a tremendous crash shattered the window behind Wade, followed instantly by the deafening report of a shotgun blast. Wade screamed, stumbling forward as buckshot tore through his right shoulder and arm. His gun clattered to the floor as he collapsed to his knees. Abigail reacted with the lightning reflexes that had once made her legend, diving sideways while drawing her second Colt in a fluid motion. Reed's hand flew to his holster, but Abigail's aim proved faster. Her first shot caught him high in the chest, staggering him backward. Her second struck his right arm, causing his half-drawn revolver to fall from suddenly nerveless fingers. "Nobody threatens my people in my kitchen," Mrs. Hollister's indignant voice carried through the shattered window, where the elderly cook stood with her smoking shotgun still braced against her shoulder. "Especially not some mangy coyotes who interrupt my bread-making." Reed Kincaid sagged against the wall, blood spreading across his shirt in an expanding crimson stain. His eyes, wide with shock, fixed on Abigail with dawning recognition. "I know. You," he gasped, each word clearly painful. "The Black Duster. Twin Colts. You're the one they called Angel of Death." Charlie stood frozen, hands raised in surrender, as Wade moaned on the floor, clutching his shredded shoulder. Outside, the gunfire had diminished to occasional scattered shots, suggesting the battle was reaching its conclusion. Abigail approached Reed slowly, her revolver trained on his chest. "You should have done your research more thoroughly, Mr. Kincaid. You might have chosen a different target." Blood bubbled at the corner of Reed's mouth as he laughed, a wet, choking sound. "Ezra always said the bounty hunter who took him in had the coldest eyes he'd ever seen." He coughed, crimson spattering his chin. "Never mentioned it was a woman." Understanding flooded Abigail's expression. "Ezra Kincaid. I brought him in for the Whitman family murders near Yuma. My brother," Reed confirmed, his voice weakening. "Swore I'd find who sent him to the gallows. Never thought—" He slid further down the wall, leaving a smear of blood against the wood. Abigail holstered her weapon and knelt beside him, recognizing that Reed Kincaid no longer posed a threat. "Your brother murdered an entire family, including 3 children, for their land and cattle. He admitted it before they hanged him." "He was still my brother," Reed whispered, his eyes growing unfocused as blood loss took its toll. "Only family." I had left. In that moment, Abigail saw beyond the hardened outlaw to the wounded core beneath, a man whose twisted sense of loyalty had led him down a path of destruction and ultimately to his death on the floor of her cabin. It was a story she had witnessed too many times during her years as a bounty hunter, how violence begat violence in an endless cycle of retribution and loss. "I'm sorry for your pain," she said quietly, meaning it despite everything. "But not for bringing your brother to justice. He made his choices, as did you." Reed's gaze fixed on something distant beyond the cabin walls. "Funny," he murmured, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Always thought I'd die under open sky, not trapped in some mine widow's cabin." His chest rose and fell once. More, a rattling breath escaping his lips, and then he was still. Abigail reached forward and gently closed his staring eyes, a final gesture of respect for an adversary who, however misguided, had fought for what he believed in. Then she rose and turned her attention to the wounded Wade Turner and the still surrendering Charlie. "Your leader is dead," she stated flatly. "The wisest course now would be to tell your remaining men to drop their weapons." Charlie nodded frantically. "I'll do it, just don't shoot me, ma'am, please." "I'm not in the business of killing surrendering men," Abigail assured him, reclaiming her first revolver from the floor. "But make no mistake, if your men continue fighting, they'll die as surely as Reed Kincaid." Miguel appeared in the doorway, his rifle held ready but pointed downward. "The others are retreating, Senora. 2 more dead, 1 badly wounded. The rest are scattering toward the eastern hills." "Help this young man convince the stragglers to surrender," Abigail instructed, gesturing toward Charlie, "and send Jackson to retrieve the doctor from Copper Junction. Sheriff Calloway should be there as well." As Miguel led Charlie outside, Abigail turned to where Mrs. Hollister had appeared at the broken window, shotgun still clutched in her gnarled hands. The elderly cook surveyed the scene with remarkable composure for someone who had just entered a gunfight. "Thank you for your timely intervention," Abigail said with genuine gratitude. "Your aim was impeccable." Mrs. Hollister sniffed dismissively. "Been handling a shotgun since before you were born, Mrs. Thornton, or whatever your name actually is." Despite her brusque tone, there was no condemnation in her weathered face, only the practical acceptance of someone who had survived long enough on the frontier to understand that people often carried secrets and hidden strengths. "Abigail is my real name," she replied with a faint smile. "The rest is complicated." "Most worthwhile things are," the cook observed sagely. "Now, I've got dough rising that won't wait for outlaws or revelations. When you're done with all this unpleasantness, there'll be fresh bread." As Mrs. Hollister retreated toward her kitchen, Abigail stood in the bullet-scarred remains of her cabin, surrounded by the aftermath of violence she had hoped never to witness again. Reed Kincaid lay dead at her feet, the culmination of a vendetta that had begun years ago with his brother's crimes and her own pursuit of justice. Outside, the night had grown still, except for the movements of the survivors securing the mining camp. The transformation was complete. Widow Thornton had vanished like morning mist, revealing Angel of Death Abigail to a world she had hoped would never see that side of her again. By dawn, Sheriff Calloway would arrive, and the full reckoning would begin, not just for the remaining members of the Rattlesnake Gang, but for Abigail herself. Her carefully constructed life lay in ruins around her, much like the cabin that had been her sanctuary. Whatever came next would require building something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed this night. First light crept across the eastern horizon, painting the sky in delicate washes of pink and gold that belied the night of violence. At Silver Creek Mine, the acrid scent of gunpowder still hung in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood and the smoky aftermath of the conflict. Workers who had been sent away for safety were beginning to return, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension as they surveyed the damage. 3 bodies lay covered with canvas tarps near the assay office: Reed Kincaid, and 2 of his men who had fallen in the initial exchange of gunfire. The wounded had been moved to the cookhouse, where Mrs. Hollister alternated between administering to their injuries and muttering disapproval at the interruption to her normal routine. Wade Turner, his shoulder heavily bandaged, sat slumped against the wall, his once threatening presence diminished by pain and the knowledge that his gang had been shattered. In the yard between buildings, the young outlaw Charlie Bennett stood, with his hands bound, watching as Miguel directed returning miners to secure the camp. The boy, for he seemed little more than that in the harsh morning light, had surrendered completely, offering information about the Rattlesnake Gang's operations with the desperate hope of leniency. Abigail observed these activities from the porch of her damaged cabin, having changed from her night's attire into a simple blouse and skirt that represented a middle ground between her two identities. The twin Colts remained holstered at her waist, no longer concealed. There seemed little point in hiding what everyone now knew. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, not yet arranged in either the severe bun of the widow or the practical braid of the bounty hunter. Garrett, the burly miner who had proven himself during the night's defense, approached with a steaming cup of coffee. "Thought you might need this, ma'am," he offered, his deep voice respectful. "Been a long night." "Thank you, Garrett." Abigail accepted the cup gratefully. "How are the men?" Confused mostly, he replied with a shrug of massive shoulders. "Trying to reconcile the lady who's been signing their pay with the woman who killed 3 men last night," Abigail finished for him, her tone matter-of-fact. "It's understandable. I've spent years keeping those worlds separate." Garrett nodded, seemingly untroubled by the revelation. "Army taught me to judge folks by what they do, not who they were before. You protected this mine, protected all of us. That counts for something." Before Abigail could respond, a rider appeared on the approach road, dust rising behind the horse pushed to a canter. She recognized Sheriff Calloway's distinctive silhouette, his badge catching the early morning light as he drew closer. "Sheriff's here," Garrett observed unnecessarily. "Want me to stay?" Abigail shook her head. "I need to face this alone. Please check on the wounded. See if any need to be moved to town when the doctor arrives." As Garrett departed, Abigail straightened her shoulders and moved to meet the approaching lawman. This moment had haunted her dreams for years. The inevitable collision of past and present, the judgment that would follow exposure of her carefully guarded secrets. Sheriff Calloway reined his horse to a stop before her, his weathered face revealing a complex mixture of concern, relief, and uncertainty as he took in her appearance and the evidence of battle scattered across the mining camp. "You're alive," he stated, dismounting stiffly. "When I heard gunfire echoing through the canyon last night, I feared the worst." "The fighting ended quickly," Abigail replied. "Reed Kincaid and 2 others are dead, 3 wounded, 1 captured. The rest fled eastward." Calloway's gaze traveled to the holstered Colts at her waist, then back to her face. Something in his expression shifted, recognition dawning as he reassessed the woman he thought he had known. "I sent a telegram to the marshal's office in Prescott," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Mentioned the Rattlesnake Gang was targeting Silver Creek Mine. Marshal Davis is riding out personally with several deputies." The name struck Abigail like a physical blow. "Davis," she repeated softly. "Robert Davis? You know the Marshal?" Calloway asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "We worked together. Years ago." Abigail's hand moved unconsciously to touch the grip of one Colt, a gesture of familiarity rather than threat. "He's the one who offered me a permanent position with the territorial law before I retired." Understanding spread across the sheriff's features. "You're her," he said, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "The Angel of Death, the bounty hunter who tracked the Whitman family killers." Abigail neither confirmed nor denied it, but her silence was answer enough. The name hung between them, a legend she had never sought, a persona she had tried to abandon. Thomas knew, Calloway stated rather than asked. "That's why he said what he did about you carrying shadows." "Thomas knew everything," Abigail acknowledged, a softness entering her voice at the mention of her late husband. "He was the first person who saw me, truly saw me, as more than what I'd been. He offered a different path when I thought there was only one road left to travel." The sheriff removed his hat, running a hand through thinning hair as he struggled to reconcile the refined widow he had known with the deadly efficient bounty hunter of frontier legend. "I need to hear it from you, Abigail," he finally said. "What happened here last night?" Abigail gestured toward the mine entrance. "Walk with me, Daniel. It's a long story, and parts of it go deeper than you might expect." The lower shaft of Silver Creek Mine remained cool, even as the morning sun heated the world above. Abigail led Sheriff Calloway through the tunnel network that had been her husband's life's work, oil lamp in hand, casting golden light against the rock walls. Miguel and Garrett accompanied them, carrying additional lamps and tools. "Reed Kincaid didn't target this mine by chance," Abigail explained as they descended the reinforced passage that had been closed since Thomas's death. "He had inside information about what lies below, information that I believe cost my husband his life." "You're suggesting Thomas was murdered?" Calloway's expression sharpened with professional interest. "The territorial inspector ruled it an accident." "The inspector saw what he was meant to see," Abigail replied, her tone hardening. "A support beam that failed. What he didn't know was that Thomas had replaced that beam himself just days earlier. It was sabotaged." They reached the end of the main tunnel, where heavy timbers blocked an opening angled sharply downward. Miguel and Garrett set to work removing the barrier, while Abigail continued her explanation. "The night before he died, Thomas was excited, more animated than I'd seen him in months. He'd been following a narrow seam of silver that suddenly vanished. Most would have abandoned the effort, but Thomas had a theory about how veins sometimes shift direction due to ancient geological events. And he found something," Calloway guessed, watching as the barrier came away to reveal the passage beyond. "He found enough to make him believe this mine held far more value than anyone suspected." Abigail held her lamp higher, illuminating the tunnel that had claimed her husband's life, but he never got to confirm it. The next day, the supposedly new support beam failed catastrophically while he was working alone in this section. Miguel stepped forward, his expression grave. Decker Mills was one of the last men to see Don Thomas alive. He helped install the support beams in this section. The name connected instantly for Calloway. "Mills was with Kincaid last night," he said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You think he sabotaged the beam, then waited 2 years before returning with the Rattlesnake Gang to claim what he believed was here." 2 years of cattle rustling and stagecoach robberies, Abigail confirmed. Building enough capital to finance a mining operation once they took control. They needed funds for equipment, workers, engineers. Stealing Silver Creek was just the first step in their plan. The barrier removed, they entered the lower shaft carefully. The tunnel showed signs of the fatal collapse. Repaired walls, new support beams, evidence of the tragedy that had occurred. But it was what lay beyond the repaired section that held their attention. Thomas's final journal entry mentioned an unusual rock formation, Abigail said, raising her lamp toward the tunnel wall, where a distinct band of darker stone cut across the lighter surrounding rock. He called it the path to the mother lode. This geological feature is what he was following when he died. Garrett stepped forward, running calloused fingers along the stone with the reverence of a man who had spent his life extracting treasure from the earth. "I've seen this before, in the Comstock mines. It's a fault line where mineral-rich solutions were forced upward through cracks in the bedrock. Follow this, and..." He moved deeper into the tunnel, his lamp illuminating the continuation of the dark band as it angled sharply downward. The others followed until they reached a small chamber that Thomas had begun to excavate before his death. "Here," Garrett directed. his light toward the chamber's far wall, where a glittering vein of ore 3 inches wide ran vertically through the rock. "Mother of God," Miguel breathed, crossing himself instinctively. Even to untrained eyes, the richness of the deposit was obvious. Threads of pure silver wove through the surrounding rock in intricate patterns, catching the lamplight and throwing it back in brilliant flashes. "High-grade silver," Garrett confirmed, his voice hushed with respect. "Possibly the richest vein I've seen in 20 years of mining. Worth a fortune, maybe several fortunes." Sheriff Calloway let out a low whistle. "No wonder Kincaid was willing to kill for it. This could make a man wealthy beyond dreams." "It's what got Thomas killed," Abigail said quietly, touching the gleaming vein with gentle fingers. "He found exactly what he'd been searching for, and someone made sure he never lived to claim it." The group fell silent, absorbing the magnitude of both the discovery and the tragedy that had accompanied it. The silver vein represented not just material wealth, but the vindication of Thomas Thornton's vision and the motive for his murder. "What will you do with it?" Calloway finally asked, turning to Abigail. She met his gaze steadily. "Exactly what Thomas would have wanted. Mine it responsibly. Ensure the men who work this claim are treated fairly and compensated well. Use the profits to build something that will outlast all of us." As they made their way back to the surface, Abigail felt a sense of closure beginning to form around the wound that had remained open since Thomas's death. The truth of what he had discovered and why he had died provided answers to questions that had haunted her for 2 years. But other questions remained, particularly about her own future now that her past had been exposed to the light of day. By midday, Silver Creek Mine had become a center of activity unlike anything it had witnessed in years. Marshal Robert Davis had arrived with 4 deputies, bringing the official weight of territorial law to bear on the aftermath of the Rattlesnake Gang's failed attempt to seize the property. Davis cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, despite his 50-plus years, with iron-grey hair and a carefully trimmed mustache that did little to soften his commanding presence. The badge on his chest gleamed with authority as he oversaw the processing of prisoners and the documentation of events. When he first laid eyes on Abigail, standing on the porch of her damaged cabin, still wearing the Colts at her hips, a rare smile softened his stern features. "Never thought I'd see the day," he remarked, approaching with an outstretched hand. "Angel of death domesticated into a mining widow." Abigail accepted his handshake with a wry expression. "Not so domesticated, it seems. Old habits resurface when necessary." "So I see." Davis gestured toward the covered bodies awaiting transport to town. 3 dead, including Reed Kincaid himself. "Impressive work for a woman who supposedly hung up her guns 5 years ago." 6 years, she corrected automatically. "And I had help." The marshal nodded, acknowledging the contributions of the miners who had stood with her. "Still, it's a fitting end to the Rattlesnake Gang. They've been a thorn in the territory's side for too long." They moved to the privacy of the repaired assay office, where Davis accepted the coffee Abigail offered before settling into a chair across from her. For a moment, they studied each other, former colleagues reunited by circumstances neither could have predicted. "Sheriff Calloway tells me you found a significant silver deposit," Davis said, getting directly to business, as was his habit. "And that you suspect Thomas Thornton was murdered because of it." "I know he was," Abigail replied firmly. "The evidence may be circumstantial, but it's compelling. Decker Mills helped install the support beam that failed, then conveniently disappeared after Thomas's death, only to return with the Rattlesnake Gang 2 years later with detailed knowledge of the mine's value." Davis nodded thoughtfully. "Mills is still alive, though injured. We'll question him thoroughly once the doctor clears him to travel. If there's evidence to support your theory, we'll pursue murder charges in addition to the attempted robbery and assault." "Thank you, Robert," Abigail said, genuine gratitude in her voice. Thomas deserves justice, however delayed. A moment of silence stretched between them before Davis addressed the question that had clearly been on his mind since his arrival. What happens now, Abigail? Your secret's out. Everyone knows who you were, who you are. The question hung in the air, demanding an answer she wasn't certain she possessed. Her carefully constructed identity as Widow Thornton had been shattered by the night's events, but returning to her former life seemed equally impossible. I don't know, she admitted, an unusual uncertainty in her voice. For 6 years, I've been building a life here, becoming someone different from the woman who tracked killers across the territory. I'm not sure I can go back to being just Widow Thornton, but I have no desire to return to bounty hunting either. Davis studied her with the perceptive gaze that had made him an effective lawman. Perhaps you don't have to choose one or the other. The territory still needs people with your skills, but not necessarily in the same capacity as before. Abigail raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. What are you suggesting? The governor is establishing a special investigative division within the marshal's office, Davis explained. Not regular deputies, but agents with particular skills who can be called upon for complex cases. Your experience as both a bounty hunter and a businesswoman would be valuable in that role. You want me to work for the territorial government? Abigail clarified, surprise evident in her tone. After I declined your offer 8 years ago. Davis smiled slightly. People change, Abigail. You've demonstrated that more convincingly than most. Besides, this wouldn't require you to abandon Silver Creek. You could manage the mine while occasionally lending your expertise to the territory when needed. The proposition was unexpected but not unwelcome. It offered a path forward that might integrate the divided aspects of her identity rather than forcing her to choose between them. I'll consider it, she promised, neither accepting nor refusing. Outright. But my first responsibility is to the people here, to ensure this mine operates as Thomas would have wanted and to rebuild what was damaged last night. Before Davis could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, Abigail could see a group of miners gathered around a returning rider, Williams, who had been sent to Copper Junction for the doctor. The man was gesturing animatedly as he delivered what appeared to be urgent news. Abigail and Davis stepped outside just as Miguel approached, his expression troubled. "Senora, we have a problem. Williams reports riders approaching from the east, at least a dozen men, heavily armed." "More of Kincaid's gang?" Davis asked sharply. Miguel shook his head. "Williams doesn't think so. These men ride in formation with matching horses. He says they look more like hired guns than outlaws." A cold certainty settled in Abigail's stomach. "Sentinel mining," she said, the pieces falling into place. "They've been trying to buy Silver Creek for months. Someone must have informed them about last night's events and possibly about what we found in the lower shaft." "How would they know about the silver vein?" Davis questioned. "The same way Kincaid knew," Abigail reasoned, her mind working rapidly. "Sentinel mining operates throughout the territory. It wouldn't be difficult for them to plant someone in my workforce or to maintain contact with someone who already had information." She turned to Miguel, her decision made. "Prepare the men. If Sentinel is sending armed representatives, they're not coming to negotiate." "You think they mean to take the mine by force?" Davis asked, though his tone suggested he already recognized the logic of her conclusion. "Reed Kincaid was right about one thing," Abigail replied grimly. "This deposit is worth killing for. Kincaid tried and failed. Sentinel mining is simply the next in line, with more resources and a veneer of legal respectability that makes them more dangerous, not less." The marshal straightened, authority emanating from his bearing. "I represent territorial law, Mrs. Thornton," No corporate militia has the right to threaten a legitimate business operation under my jurisdiction." Abigail nodded gratefully, but her expression remained grave. "Unfortunately, Robert, out here, the difference between legal and illegal often comes down to who has more guns and who writes the reports afterward. Sentinel Mining has powerful friends in the territorial capital." She gazed eastward, where dust on the horizon confirmed Williams's report of approaching riders. The confrontation with the Rattlesnake Gang had been decisive but straightforward. Criminals attempting to steal what wasn't theirs. This new threat operated in the grey territory, between lawful business and corporate thuggery, with resources far beyond what Reed Kincaid had commanded. "It seems," Abigail observed with grim humor, "that finding one of the richest silver deposits in the territory might prove more dangerous than my years spent hunting killers." Marshal Davis followed her gaze to the approaching dust cloud. "The difference is that you're not facing this alone. You have the law on your side now." "We'll see if that's enough," Abigail replied, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on the pearl grip of her Colt. "We'll see." The riders from Sentinel Mining crested the final rise overlooking Silver Creek Mine at precisely noon, the sun directly overhead casting harsh light that eliminated shadows and revealed every detail of the tableau below. 12 men on matching chestnut horses, led by a figure in an immaculate black suit that seemed deliberately out of place in the rugged terrain. They found not the vulnerable, battle-damaged camp they had expected, but a mining operation prepared for their arrival. Marshal Davis and his deputies stood prominently near the main office, badges gleaming in the sunlight. Miners positioned strategically around the property carried rifles and pickaxes with equal comfort. And standing directly in the center of the yard, waiting with a stillness that spoke of absolute confidence, was Abigail Thornton, the twin colts at her hips no longer concealed by pretense or propriety. The man in the black suit raised a hand, bringing his entourage to a halt at the edge of the property. For several heartbeats, the only sound was the jingle of harness and the soft snort of horses sensing the tension in the air. "Quite the reception committee, Mrs. Thornton," the man called, his voice carrying the refined tones of Eastern education. "One might think you weren't pleased to receive visitors." Sentinel Mining stopped being welcome visitors when they decided armed intimidation was an acceptable negotiation tactic, Mr. Hargrove, Abigail replied, identifying the company's regional director without hesitation. Hargrove's eyebrows rose slightly at her recognition. "I'm flattered, you know me. We've never had the pleasure of meeting directly." "I make it my business to know potential threats," Abigail stated simply. "Your reputation precedes you." Marshal Davis stepped forward, his badge catching the sunlight. "This property is currently under the protection of territorial law enforcement. Any attempt to coerce or threaten Mrs. Thornton or her operation will be met with the full force of that law." A flicker of annoyance crossed Hargrove's aristocratic features before his composure reasserted itself. "There seems to be a misunderstanding, Marshal. Sentinel Mining is a legitimate business enterprise with interests throughout the territory. We've simply come to offer assistance after hearing of the unfortunate incident with outlaws last night." "Your concern is touching," Abigail replied dryly, "especially given its remarkable timing and the armed escort you deem necessary to express it." Hargrove dismissed the observation with an elegant gesture. "The territories remain dangerous, as last night's events demonstrated. Prudent travelers employ protection." His gaze sharpened. "Speaking of last night, I understand congratulations are in order. Not many mining operations could repel the notorious Rattlesnake Gang. Not many mining operations are run by former bounty hunters," Sheriff Calloway interjected, moving to stand beside Abigail. "Perhaps Sentinel wasn't aware of Mrs. Thornton's particular skills when planning this visit." The revelation registered in Hargrove's eyes, a calculation being revised, odds recalibrated. His gaze returned to Abigail with new assessment. taking in the confidence of her stance and the well-worn holsters that spoke of practical use rather than ornamental display. "I see," he said finally. "That does place matters in a different light." He paused, seemingly weighing options before continuing. "Mrs. Thornton, despite appearances, I am authorized to make a legitimate business proposal. Perhaps we could discuss it without the theatrical standoff?" Abigail considered the request, then nodded once. "You may approach alone. Your men remain where they are." After a moment's hesitation, Hargrove dismounted and walked forward, the precision of his movements suggesting military training beneath the corporate exterior. He stopped several paces from Abigail, close enough for private conversation, but maintaining a respectful distance. "I'll be direct," he began, his voice lowered. "Sentinel Mining knows what you've found in the lower shaft. The deposit is significant, perhaps the richest in the territory. Our offer is $100,000 for complete ownership of Silver Creek Mine. The sum was staggering, far beyond what most believed the struggling mine to be worth, but still less than the true value of what lay beneath." "Not interested," Abigail replied without hesitation. Hargrove's facade of civility slipped momentarily. "Be reasonable, Mrs. Thornton. You lack the capital to exploit this deposit properly. Sentinel has the engineers, equipment, and distribution networks to maximize its potential." "I have something more valuable than capital," Abigail countered. "Knowledge of what this mine truly means. It was my husband's dream, Mr. Hargrove. His legacy, and I believe he was murdered to prevent him from realizing that dream." "A tragic accident by all reports," Hargrove replied smoothly, though something flickered behind his eyes. "An accident arranged by someone who knew what Thomas had discovered," Abigail stated, watching his reaction carefully. "Someone who then waited patiently for the right moment to claim what wasn't theirs." Understanding dawned in Hargrove's expression, followed quickly by calculation. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Thornton, one that would be difficult to prove after so much time, perhaps. But territorial marshals are remarkably persistent when investigating murder, especially when the victim was respected and well-liked." She nodded toward Davis, who watched their exchange with the patient vigilance of a career lawman. "And I have certain skills in uncovering hidden truths, as my former profession demonstrated." For the first time, genuine uncertainty showed in Hargrove's demeanor. Whatever script he had prepared for this confrontation had not included facing a widow. With the combined authority of frontier justice and personal vengeance at her disposal. "Sentinel Mining had nothing to do with your husband's death," he stated firmly, though the protest came too quickly to be entirely convincing. "I believe you," Abigail surprised him by agreeing. "Corporations don't kill people, Mr. Hargrove. People kill people, often for corporations. The question is how far up the chain knowledge and responsibility extend." She gestured toward the mine entrance, where miners continued working despite the tense standoff. "Silver Creek will remain independent, Mr. Hargrove. I'll develop this. Deposit my way, Thomas's way. The wealth will benefit the people who work this claim and the community that supports it." "Very noble," Hargrove replied, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "And how long before larger interests simply overwhelm your independent operation? The mining industry is consolidating, Mrs. Thornton. The future belongs to companies with the capital and political connections to dominate." "Perhaps," Abigail acknowledged, "but not today, and not this mine." Her hand rested casually near one pearl-handled Colt. "Now, I believe our business is concluded." Hargrove studied her for a long moment, measuring resolve against practicality. Whatever calculation he made apparently convinced him that further pressure would be counterproductive. "For now," he conceded with the careful dignity of a man unaccustomed to retreat. "But Sentinel's offer remains open, should you reconsider." "I won't," Abigail stated with quiet certainty. Without another word, Hargrove turned and walked back to his waiting men. The company representatives departed as they had arrived, in formation, maintaining the appearance of power and control even in withdrawal. As the dust settled behind the departing riders, Marshal Davis moved to stand beside. "Abigail, that won't be the end of it," he observed. "Men like Hargrove don't accept defeat easily." "I'm counting on it," Abigail replied, surprising him. "Because when Sentinel tries again, and they will, they might lead us to whoever was ultimately responsible for Thomas's death." "You're using yourself as bait," Sheriff Calloway realized, concern evident in his voice. "I'm seeking justice," Abigail corrected gently, "and protecting what matters. Everything else is simply a means to those ends." As the three stood watching the horizon where Sentinel's representatives had disappeared, Miguel approached with news that the miners had extracted the first samples from the newly reopened lower shaft. The ore's quality exceeded even Garrett's initial assessment. Silver Creek Mine would soon be among the most productive in the territory. "Thomas would be proud," Calloway said, genuine emotion in his gruff voice, "of the mine and of you." Abigail smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way few had witnessed since her husband's death. He saw potential where others saw only obstacles. In the mine and in me. She touched the pearl grip of one Colt briefly. "Perhaps it's time I truly honored that vision by becoming all of who I am, rather than hiding half of myself away." The sun began its western descent, casting long shadows across Silver Creek Mine, shadows that no longer represented secrets and deception, but simply the natural interplay of light and darkness that defined the frontier landscape. Abigail Thornton, widow and avenging angel, mine owner and former bounty hunter, stood at the crossroads of her past and future, finally ready to embrace both. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.